Our next speaker is Brenda Clifton. She's the Senior Restoration Botanist with Skagit River System Cooperative. Brenda is a plant ecologist with over 20 years of experience in plant biology and propagation. Ms. Clifton has a bachelor's degree in botany, and her master's thesis is in plant physiology. She's a certified professional wetland scientist with the Society of Wetland Scientists and was awarded Restorationist of the Year by the Society for Ecological Restoration Northwest Chapter in 2022. At the Skagit River System Cooperative, she manages the vegetation aspects of salmon habitat restoration projects, including designing projects, conducting vegetation surveys, and overseeing a native nursery with over 15,000 plants.
So I'm excited to talk to you today about best management practices for assisted migration in habitat restoration projects. This is actually a work that was put together by a subcommittee of the Forest Adaptation Network, and it involved several different people in several different organizations. The Forest Adaptation Network is just a group that mostly talks about climate change and planting trees. We get together quarterly. So if you have interest in joining that group, you can email Rowan Braybook. Her email is to the top and to the right. I'll start with some definitions of assisted migration. Assisted migration is basically just people moving plants from one area to another. And in our context, we're doing that because we're hoping that moving plants from an area where climate is modeled to be similar to the area where we're planting trees in the future will ensure the success of our planting projects. For the purpose of this paper, we used 3 definitions of assisted migration. Assisted population migration, where you're basically moving a species within its current natural occurrence. For example, moving Douglas fir from Oregon to Washington. Like Douglas fir already occurs in both Oregon and Washington. So basically, you're just moving an Oregon population into Washington. There's also assisted range expansion, and that's when you're moving a tree just outside of its current range. So, for example, if you were going to plant Oregon ash I'm in Northwest Washington. So if I put Oregon ash in Northwest Washington planting, currently Oregon ash mostly occurs in Southwest Washington. And so I'm moving it just outside of its existing range. And then there's assisted species migration, and that's when you're moving a species far outside of its existing range and beyond its natural migration boundary. For example, if you wanted to plant California redwoods in a city park in Seattle. There are also 2 different approaches to assisted migration. There's the species rescue perspective, where you're looking at it from the perspective of a plant that is suffering from climate change, and you're moving that species into a better climate. And then there's the ecosystem services perspective, and I think that's what most of us are looking at. And that's when we're looking at it from an ecosystem and moving climate adapted plants into our ecosystem, I think in our case, to have better success of our plantings in the future. The theory behind assisted migration and why people think it will work is because climate shapes plant phenology, morphology, and growth. And so things like when flowers bloom, when buds break, how tolerant plants are to drought have evolved based on the climate that they grow in. And we know that plants can migrate themselves, especially the plants we put in our riparian areas. Their seeds are distributed by wind and animals, so they can move, but it's looking like they can't move fast enough to keep up with future climate change. And so as a result, it's projected that plants will suffer with altered growing seasons. They may grow less, and we may even see changes in forest composition. So the idea is that we can help the health of our plants and forests by migrating them further than they could do naturally, which sounds great. Except there's a lot of risks associated with this practice. For one thing, the plants we move may not survive well in their new setting. The seed zones that we've been using for decades were developed by testing a lot of seeds and seeing which areas they grow best in. And a lot of that they found they grew best near where they were from. There's also a risk of the introduction of invasive plant genotypes or species. I mean, we all know the effect of moving Himalayan blackberry from Asia to North America has been, but there could also be an invasive genotype. We learned in 2020 at one of the talks about a flower in California that was moved from Southern California to Northern California, and this species already occurred in Northern California, but the population they moved from Southern California became invasive, whereas the Northern California population was not. We may accidentally introduce invasive pests or insects or pathogens, diseases. These could travel on the seedlings or seeds that we're moving. And we've already had some examples of pathogens moving on plants that have just been detrimental to the ecosystem and economics of where they attack. For example, chestnut blight, or sudden oak death have just devastated huge populations of plants. Assisted migration could result in poor community structure. For example, if you're moving a redwood from California, are you also moving the, understory ferns that come with it? And if you put it into a riparian planting in Western Washington, is it going to fill the same role that it fulfilled in California? We really don't know the answers to these questions. There's a risk of genetic alteration of existing populations for the worse. If the plants you're bringing up have poor genetic diversity because they all came from one pine cone, and we introduce them to an area where you also have that plant occurring naturally, then when they breed with the surrounding plants, they could reduce the genetic variation of the plants around it as well. All these risks increase with the distance that plants are moved. The risk is less if you're moving plants from Southern Washington to Northern Washington than if you're bringing plants from California to Washington. But at the same time, we're in a situation where there are risks associated with doing nothing. We're definitely seeing some negative effects of climate change on our local species already. And so with this subcommittee of the Forest Adaptation Network, we came up with a decision tree that practitioners can go through if they're thinking of incorporating assisted migration. This table is divided into two sides. On the left is species rescued migration, but for this talk, we're going to focus on the right-hand side, which is ecosystem services migration, because we're looking at bringing in plants into an ecosystem or our restoration projects. I'm going to go through this tree step by step in the next couple slides. I sent this paper out to our listserv, but if you'd like a copy, feel free to email me. In order for us to better understand this decision tree, I'm going to use a real life example. The Department of Fish and Wildlife has a restoration project in the South Fork of the Skagit River. So the Skagit River is in northwest Washington, and it runs from Canada into the Salish Sea. When it gets to the city of Mount Vernon, the river splits, and this restoration site is in the South Fork in the Skagit Delta, right above salty water, but still influenced by tides. So this island had been farmed and diked for many years, but last summer the Department of Fish and Wildlife had a construction project where they breached the levee in many spots and cut in a bunch of channels so fish could access the site. Now we are planting along these channels. The first step in the decision tree is to gather background information. You want to see if you can find any information that addresses ethical considerations at the site. We as practitioners have the ethical responsibility to prevent irreversible effects from assisted migration. And so we need to determine what constitutes an acceptable risk of harm. Another really important ethical consideration are what cultural species we have in the ecosystem we're working in, and we have to make sure not to harm these cultural species. We also need to think about ecological issues. What are the priority species and ecosystem functions for which assisted migration can be considered? If we're doing a riparian restoration project, we are probably pretty well versed in the function of the ecosystem that we're working with. But we should also see if we can find any information about the probability of assisted migration success for any of the keystone species in that ecosystem, like how well they're going to do if we move them, and also think of any negative impacts of relocated species on other species or ecosystem functions. And there may be organizational concerns. Are there any laws or policies in your organization on how climate adaptation should be approached? Is assisted migration even permitted? And then who within your organization has the authority to initiate assisted migration, and who is going to get the funding and who's going to monitor these projects? So are important things for you to consider. Also, try and collect all the models that you can about predicted climate change and species migration in your area. For example, in the top right-hand graph, this is the biophysic aspects of a forest in Southeast Washington, and this applies to where I am as well. On the graph on the left, you have the current conditions. And as you can see, from January to June, we have a surplus of water. Most of this is held in snow in the winter, and it extends for how long we have water as the snow melts. Therefore, we have a small deficit of water from June to September when it starts raining again and the surplus goes up. Moving forward, it's modeled that the surplus of water is going to be greater in the winter, but since less of this will be stowed in snow, the deficit is going to begin in May, and it's going to be greater in the summertime until it starts raining in September, October again. In the bottom right, the databasin.org is a great source of looking at where species occur and where they might migrate to. This is a visual for Western red cedar. On the bottom of the graphic, you can see red dots. This is where Western red cedar currently exists, but is starting to die off. And then in the top part of the graphic, you can see green dots. This is where Western red cedar new populations are projected to appear. In the middle of the graphic, you see the black dots, and these are areas where Western red cedar exists now and they think it will continue to exist in modeled climate change scenarios. Although I'm seeing that Western red cedar is occurring in wetter and wetter areas, even if it's going to persist. So you can generally see that the trend is to migrate up north and to the east. But at the same time, this map on the lower right is the Skagit River that I work on, and most of my restoration projects are in the pink agriculture areas and the orange developed areas. And so there's not a lot of opportunity for the seeds of migrating plants to get into my restoration projects. Step 2 is determine if assisted migration is even feasible. Look at the time frame you have for your project or your funding. Figure out how you're going to source the plant materials. If you're going to bring up seed from your source, you're going to need extra time to do a contracted grow. And it may be really hard to find a nursery if you don't bring up seeds where you can buy the seedlings from the seed zone that you'd like. Also look at the costs, moving plants around, making sure they are disease free, and monitoring your projects is all going to cost money. So make sure that's in your budget. And then finally, determine whether the stakeholders are supportive. For example, a project that has assisted migration in it in a city park in Seattle is probably going to have more support than in a national park, for example. Check to see in step 1 if there has been any opposition to assisted migration in your area in the past. So step 4 is identifying which species in your planting are at risk from climate change. Species that I came up with were, of course, Western red cedar. As you can see in the picture below, we're already seeing thinning of branches, branches dying, whole tops of trees dying, and yellowing in trees. And these are all signs of stress from climate change. But other species I thought would be worth considering were Western hemlock. It actually has a hard time transitioning from fall to winter if there's not a cold period before a hard freeze. I have seen die off of Western hemlock if it goes straight from summer into winter. Red alder is another species I considered since it really likes the wet areas. I also thought about Douglas fir. I know they're already seeing some effects of climate change in the Willamette Valley. But since there's so much risk associated with assisted migration, I decided to stick with the species that is the most at risk from climate change. So for this example, I'm sticking with Western red cedar. But if you would like, you can run through this decision tree with each of these species to see if it's appropriate to do assisted migration or not. So step 5 is to determine the geographical scale of your action. I already know that I'm doing assisted population migration because I'm working in an area where Western red cedar is already appropriate, and then I'm going to bring in Western red cedar from somewhere else. But I use the seed lot selection tool to determine where exactly I'm going to source those seeds from. If you're curious, in 2020, we did a whole presentation on how to use the seed lot selection tool. It's on the Skagit Watershed Council YouTube page. And so you can learn exactly how to set it. But in brief, the blue pointer is where our restoration site. And after you run the model, the darker red the area, the more appropriate the seeds will be in the climate that the period that I set, which is 2071 to 2100. So you can see that there are lowland Puget Sound areas in southern Washington that are appropriate to source seed, and even down to the Willamette Valley. So the Forest Adaptation Network has actually done a contracted grow with some Willamette Valley seeds. And so this is the Western red cedar I have available, and I'm going to do the next step with Western red cedar from the Willamette Valley. So Karasov Olson has already developed this great risk analysis for assisted migration, but it's really specific. So you need to go through all the steps we went through and pick a specific site, a specific species, and a specific seed source before you go through this risk analysis. This risk analysis is available on the internet, or I can send it to you. And not only does it come with the analysis in the article, but it also comes with an Excel sheet that allows you to visualize the risk. And so for each section, you answer the questions they give you, and your answers will determine if you set the risk at low, moderate, high, or very high. And then you also set the confidence level from low to high based on how sure you are of your answers. Like, do you have scientific research or are you just guessing? When I did the specific scenario of moving Willamette Valley cedars into Northwest Washington, I had very few areas that were high risk. So there is a high risk, as we talked about, of no action at all. There was also a high risk of an action to the target in the case of the relocated population causing undesired evolution in the target. And this is the risk that like we talked about before, that the seed source that I'm moving has low genetic diversity. And then when that population evolves moving forward, you'll kind of form a bottleneck in the population. There was also a high risk in the action to non-targets. This is the risk that the competitive interaction negatively affects other Western red cedars. So since the ones I'm bringing up and the ones that I'm there are competing for the same resources, there's a high risk that the Western red cedars I import could negatively affect the ones that are already there, except it's a restoration project and there aren't too many on my site. And then there's a high risk that it's not of irreversibility of the managed relocation action. So once I bring in these Western red cedars from Oregon, I'm not going to be able to tell the difference between their offspring and the local offspring. So if they do turn out to be invasive, I don't have any way of eradicating them. But despite these few high risk areas, this risk analysis found the risks posed by assisted migration to be acceptable. For one, there was no single category that made the project unacceptably risky. Also, the confidence scores were relatively high. We're starting already to have quite a bit of research out there about the effects of climate change on Western red cedars. And generally, the distribution of risk was low enough to avoid catastrophic problems. So this is back to our decision tree. And if you go through step 6 and find that the risks are acceptable, then you can move on to step 7, the best management practices. But if you go through step 6 and you find that the risk is unacceptable, we recommend that you go back to step 5 and reduce the geographic scale of the action. So maybe try the risk analysis again using Western red cedars from southern Washington, or even in the Skagit watershed, there's Fidago Island, which is in the rain shadow. In the summers, there are already hotter and drier, so that may be another option of where to source seeds. So the best management practices for assisted population migration are to focus on species that are at risk from climate change. Since assisted migration is risky, it's important that we choose species that are also at risk so that the benefits outweigh the risks. Another good management practice is to choose to migrate seeds over seedlings. It's a lot easier to make sure you're preventing the movement of pests on seeds than on plants. Make sure, though, to include plants with different climatic tolerances. Just because the seed lot selection tool said to use plants from the Willamette Valley in Oregon, that should probably not be the only place you're sourcing seeds from. I could try some seeds from Western Washington or Fidalgo Island, like I talked about, because it's just a model and we're not really sure which of those seedlings are going to do well now and which of those seedlings are going to do well in the future. Make sure to plan for difficulties in acquiring stock. It is likely going to be difficult to get plants or even seeds from the areas where you want to source your plants. Before you start, make sure you have a protocol to detect, isolate, and eliminate pests. Even with seeds, there are some diseases that you could be transplanting, and so you should research that and have a plan to make sure you don't do that before you start. Also, plan for poor performance of your assisted migrated stock. The way that we're going to do it is to increase density of our plantings and also to include some local seeders in case the assisted migrated stock fails. And then finally, before you even start planting, develop a monitoring plan so you can monitor your assisted migrated plants and adaptively manage your assisted migration program within your organization. Are there any questions?
I don't have any questions yet, but this could be a really good time while they come in to maybe go back to the slides that people missed. The case study, I think, is the last one that a few people were stuck on. Maybe we could just bring up the next slide after that.
These are some models that are pertinent to climate change and species migration in the area of my restoration project. So the one in the top right shows the biophysical aspects of a forest in Washington, and it basically shows how the present is on the left and the future is on the right. And it basically shows how the snow in the mountains melting earlier is going to increase the deficit of water in the summer. And then the bottom right hand is a model from databasin.org, and they have these for a lot of different species in a lot of different areas. And it shows how Western red cedar is going to migrate moving forward. The red areas in the bottom are where it occurs now, but it's dying off. The black areas are where it's occurring now, and they expect it to continue to occur. And then the green areas in the north are areas where it's modeled to occur moving forward. So you can kind of see the migration of the cedar moving north and east. And then finally is a land use map from the Skagit River where I plant trees, showing blockages to natural assisted migration, mostly in the form of agriculture in cities, to let me know that the natural migration of the cedars is not necessarily going to put climate adapted species into my planting. I'm probably going to have to put them there myself.
What's your view of redwood assisted migration?
I think that and I haven't done the risk assessment for that species, but I think in my restoration plantings, it would be too risky. Whereas perhaps if you did the risk analysis for the a planting in a city park, it would be less risky. And so I think you need to look at it on a case by case basis.
Okay. And do you know of any evidence of phytophthora being introduced to Washington through assisted migration plantings?
No, but I do know that it's already in southern Washington, Phytophthora, sudden oak death.
Okay.
And I do know that when they did genetic analyses of forests in California that had been decimated, they traced the disease back to native plant nurseries. And so, yeah, it's very high risk. But there's a program where nurseries have to be certified as sudden oak death free. And so you can check with the nursery you're getting plants from and make sure that they have this certification before you source plants from there.
Right. And have you used very small and isolated plant populations as indicators of what species may do well as an assisted migration species? Um, and we have, for example, very small populations of bay laurel near Seattle, very small populations of big leaf maple in Idaho, and a similar population of Gary oak in British Columbia.
Yeah, I don't consider it part of my assisted migration program, but I am trying in general to increase the diversity of the plants in my nursery. And so we try and collect seed from exactly these small isolated populations like you're referring to. For example, lodgepole pine in Darrington. It's actually come from eastern Washington into western Washington in that small area based on the lahar making the soil so well drained. And so we are targeting um, those isolated populations for the plants that are in our nursery, but we're only sourcing them from the Skagit watershed so far.
And do you have experience incorporating ponderosa pine into your plantings?
No, I also feel very strongly that when I did the risk analysis, it would come up as pretty high risk. And also traditionally, it is harder for your plants to survive now when you move them from east to west instead of south to north. So it's likely that plants from Oregon, Western Oregon and California will do better here now than plants from Eastern Washington. I think that's associated with needle cast, like fungal diseases.
What metrics are you using to define when migration is too risky?
So Karasov-Olson give you a few metrics that decide that it is too risky. One is the confidence level is really low, like you don't have enough information to be sure about your answers. Two, there's a single category that makes the project too risky, like for example, under risk of 5 spread and invasion, if the if Western red cedar had the traits of an invasive species and that turned out to be, very high risk, I mean, you'd just look at it and be like, no. Or maybe under 6 adverse socioeconomic values, if there turned out to be a high risk to a culturally or economically important species, that would be a line where I'd be like, no, this is too risky. I'm hoping with Western red cedar, which is a cultural species, that we're helping it instead of hurting it. But generally, the risk assessment, you have to determine for yourself what level of risk you think is too risky. They give you a few guidelines, but this is to help you visualize and really think about the risks involved.
Could you share the Forest Adaptation Network information again?
And it's Rowan Braybrook. The Forest Adaptation Network is sponsored by the Northwest Natural Resource Group, and her email is to the top and to the right. we usually just meet quarterly, and there are presentations about planting trees and climate change, and then some subcommittees that are working on things like best management practices.
Do you have any examples of situations or species that are too risky?
We just finished developing our decision tree, and so I actually haven't gone through the decision tree with any other species except for Western red cedar. But step, I think 4 is to determine which species are at risk from climate change in your area. And I think any species that's not already at risk from climate change, it would be too risky to use assisted migration with that species. So maybe like black cottonwood, where it's, really diverse, it occurs all over the country. We're not seeing any negative effects. If you can't justify that the species is at risk from climate change, you can't counteract the risks that are associated with assisted migration. I have one more question. So how is this all tracked so we can know where we are sourcing seeds from in the future? So for me personally, we have a spreadsheet, and it lists where the seed sources for all of the seeds that we grow in our nursery, or the seed. When I purchase plants, I have records of all the seed sources. And then my plan for the restoration project is I'm going to plant the assisted migrated plants in groups of maybe 100, and the local plants in groups, and I'm going to flag them all and then GPS where they are planted. So in the future, I can monitor which of these groups are doing well and associate it back to where I source the seed from.
We have a request to see the step 3 slide again, too. I think that was one that some people missed.
I think I missed that myself because I think I counted wrong. See, step 3, I think, is identify species at risk. Let me look at my table. So, I skipped step 2, which is determine if assisted migration is necessary. That was my bad. And then step 3 is determine if assisted migration is feasible.
Mm.
But that all comes back to, are there plants in your planting that are at risk from climate change?
And how much time did it take you to gather background information and run through the decision tree and risk analysis for the Western red cedar example?
3 or 4 hours. Of course, since these are ecosystems and species that I work with all the time, I had a lot of information already collected.